The important thing for them is the power to dissolve the hierarchy.
Yes.
Because what they see is that if you're in a hierarchy and then you're not, then in that movement from hierarchy to not is the freedom to leave it.
Right.
And they're like, what's the nature of that freedom to leave that hierarchy?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Book on Fire podcast. We're currently experiencing some freezing conditions at our place, and it's snowing a little bit. This is interesting since we will now be talking about the chapter called Unfreezing the Ice Age.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not that interesting. But yeah, so last episode
We've recreated a little ice age here
ice age,
just to get the mood right for what we're about to talk about.
Right.
Yeah.
The last episode we went away from the book for a moment and discussed some anthropology relevant to the text that is sometimes obliquely referred to, but not directly addressed often. But now we're back to the book, and we're on to Chapter 3, Unfreezing the Ice Age, In and Out of Chains, the Protean Possibilities of Human Politics. They got a lot of P's in there, in that
Yeah,
subtitle.
that's kind of nice, huh?
Right. So we're going to get into all this, of course, but Proteus was a Greek sea god who was a shapeshifter who changed from one form to another. And so when they say protean possibilities, what they are saying is that they're referring to their thesis that humans through most of our history have moved in and out of different forms of political organization. And in this case, in and out of chains. Which we will get more into that. But sort of like playing with...
Echoes of Rousseau.
Maybe
in there. Yeah.
So that's what we'll be doing this time. But we want to give you guys a little bit of context because they don't actually just stick in the Ice Age here. Maybe it would be helpful to even understand, like, when was the Ice Age or what kind of terms are we talking?
Right. Yeah, we are going to the Ice Age for this chapter, for part of it. But there's really there's a lot coming at you here in this chapter. It's kind of a theme of the book, in a way. I was actually thinking about this just yesterday about one of my favorite books in the world is this book called 1,000 Plateaus by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. I love that book so much that I haven't even read it all. I started reading it 30 years ago and I still haven't read it all. I'm just savoring every little bit, every little chapter. But in the early pages of that book, they talk about how a book in general is a kind of machine. And I was like, what kind of machine is the dawn of everything? And I was picturing, I think it's like a spaghetti machine.
What?
That just shoots rapid fire the spaghetti against the wall, and only some of it sticks. So the spaghetti just flies.
Wow.
And then it's up to us, to figure out what spaghetti sticks to the wall and what doesn't.
Okay. I think I'm gonna have to sit with this. What kind of machine is the dawn of everything, and come back. But I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the spaghetti machine.
And this chapter has a lot of really good spaghetti. Really good, nutritious, tasty, sticky spaghetti.
Stuck to the wall. Yeah. What you're absolutely correct about is that they're doing a lot in this chapter.
Yeah.
And they're drawing widely. They bring in a lot of different interests. Some of them make more sense with the thesis than others. And so we're going to be making sense of that. Part
of what's really fun about The Dawn of Everything is that there is so much. You just turn the page and now they're talking about a whole nother different thing. Or they have a theory, or they have some beef that they're kind of, and it's always it's exciting in that way, where you're presented with something new. There's not really a dull moment.
No.
Usually.
No. It's a wild ride.
In the book, which is nice. Yeah. So Unfreezing the Ice Age, one thing that I've done for this chapter and there's a link to this in the show notes, but I've created a visual timeline. And this might not be the only time that I do this for a chapter of the book. I am kind of obsessed with timelines.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I mean, the visual timeline that has like a little hash mark for different events, especially when we're talking about anthropology, we're talking about prehistory, we're talking about all kinds of like big time type of things. I have fantasized, in fact, about, like, we just recently built a library here on the land, and I was like, I wonder if I can make room for the big timeline, like the big timeline that's like 20 feet long that has like everything on it, so that we can refer to like, wait, when did humans arrive in Australia? It's on the timeline, or when was the Hermetic corpus rediscovered and translated into European languages? That would be on the timeline too. I'm always trying to remember these types of dates. So anyway, I haven't made the giant timeline yet, but I discovered a kind of like an app on the internet where you can pretty easily generate timelines with pictures. So I've done one for this episode, partially because this is an episode where this is a chapter in the book where it is more solidly about archaeology, and they are talking about the Ice Age, right? Unfreezing the Ice Age. And so I wanted to make sure that we have a pretty good set of reference points for like, what is the Ice Age again? We're not living in the Ice Age now. When was the transition? And there's also terms of anthropology like Paleolithic and Neolithic that are also helpful to know. And so check out the timeline. I've put some pictures on there, and I think I'll be making others. But just to summarize like the basic things, so what is the Ice Age? The Ice Age is the kind of common name for what in geology is called the Pleistocene. The Pleistocene is the Ice Age, and the Ice Age is the period that spans from about 2.5 million years ago all the way up to the glacial retreat. The end of the Pleistocene is marked fairly precisely by the geologists at 11,700 years ago, so 9,700 BC. And a new geological era was ushered in, and that era is called the Holocene, Holo scene. And the Holocene is the warmer, wetter, more fertile climatic period that came after that. So those are some terms, the Pleistocene, the Holocene, but then also we talk about the Paleolithic. So whenever you hear about Paleolithic, the Neolithic, there's also another term called the Mesolithic, which is kind of in between those two. And those are terms of anthropology that talk about human history, so these are not geological terms, but they have some overlap with the geological terms because like the Paleolithic, the lithic in there is stone. So it's like Paleolithic is like the old Stone Age. And it's the time starting with the first evidence for the usage of stone tools by humans. But at this point, it's not even Homo sapiens, but by hominids in general. And that goes back 3.3 million years, I just read. I didn't realize it was that far back. But that's even further than the Pleistocene, right? Wow. And then what's called the Neolithic, which is not really covered in this chapter, but what's called the Neolithic, which was the arrival of durable, long-term agricultural settlements in Eurasia. And not entirely coincidentally, the onset of the Neolithic comes about pretty closely aligned with the geological turn into the Holocene. Yeah. So these terms do line up a little bit, like the Paleolithic and the Pleistocene line up fairly well. Once you get into the Holocene, first you have the Neolithic, and then you end up having like the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and these other ages that are not Stone Ages.
So for this discussion, like how long ago did what we would consider modern anatomical humans evolve?
Yeah, modern anatomical humans for a long time.
By modern, I mean made like us.
Yeah, anatomically modern humans is the phrase that I see in the literature often. And it's usually put at about 200,000 years ago, although I've occasionally seen references to it being a bit older, like, well, I mean, like another 100,000 years, like 300,000 years.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that there's some debate about that,
Right.
but let's say 200,000 years conservatively.
Right. Yeah, because the first section of this chapter, David spends some time talking about that vast period of human prehistory. This is called the dawn of everything, right? But there's a couple 100,000 years of humans around that we know of.
Yes.
And they spend some time talking about why they wait to talk about what humans were up to until the Ice Age.
Right.
And why the reason that they do this is because they think that if we project too much onto that period in which we don't really have very much information at all, because the oldest digs they're going to talk about are going to be within the Ice Age. The archaeological evidence that they're going to be discussing is Ice Age evidence and sooner than that.
Well, and not just Ice Age evidence, but relatively recent,
that's true.
Because the Ice Age goes back 2.5 million years.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So, yeah, but what Janet's talking about is that, like, the material that they're going to talk about in this chapter, which the oldest material that they talk about is about 30,000 years ago. 30,000 years ago. Anatomically, modern humans go back at least 200,000 years. Hominins go back, stone tool use goes back 3.3 million years.
Right.
And so a question comes up immediately is like, why is a book called The Dawn of Everything? Why does it start only 30,000 years ago?
They think that since we can't know very much about that time period, we're going to be creating stories. And in fact, they refer to this kind of storytelling where we project onto the future as sort of being similar to the way that myth is used. Like Greek myths, they give the example of, and then they also give the example of the dream time of Aboriginal Australians.
Right.
When they're giving examples. And
yeah, right. Yeah.
But where this gets interesting to me, since they brought up the dream time, and weren't just talking about the Greek myth, which is it's a pretty different, like one is like the story of empire at the point with which we're talking. And one is the story of an indigenous group of people's relationship to land, And so the two examples they give, they may see as serving the same function, but I see them as somewhat different in some ways,
Right.
Because in a lot of the way that Greek myth evolved over time, it grew to reinforce patriarchy. It grew to reinforce participation in the governance and acceptance of one's life and role within the hierarchy,
Yeah, right.
And that's how the myths evolved. If you study Greek myth, how they started and how they ended were pretty different and had like a enforcement of social norms.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
But the dream time...
Myths serve a lot of functions.
They serve a lot of functions, right?
Yeah, and it's not just to fill in the gaps of history. There's also other things that they're doing.
Right, and this is going to be important for us, I think, because, with the dream time, the Aboriginal Australian mythos, their dream time is very similar to a lot of the different origin and creation myths of different original peoples on Turtle Island, but what is often referred to as the original instructions, which are not just how things were at the beginning, but also why are humans here, what are humans for, and what is our responsibility in that web of relations of creation.
Right.
So there's more of a why are we here and how should we be within those webs of life. And I think that it's important to make that distinction and say that, yes, sometimes myths are used to actually enforce and reify a power structure. And sometimes they're used for people to use a sort of a moral compass and a guideline for life making and meaning making.
Totally, yeah.
And so I just think it's interesting because they use both of those examples and I'm like, those are very different, actually.
Right.
Right. But both of them do feel relevant to me here because the Davids are going to be sort of doing their own forms of myth making, in my opinion, just because they're looking to the archaeological evidence and examining it, and then they say they're not going to look at
that's true.
the history before that.
Yeah.
because it would be projecting our own values onto it, but they're still going to be doing that.
Yeah.
With the evidence that they're talking about.
Yeah. They make claims, at least, that go back 40,000 years. Yeah, and they feel like they have got what it takes to make claims about what people were doing going back at least that far.
Right.
But in here, they say that we can't make claims about what people were doing any further than that.
Than the 40,000 years
than
ago.
the 40,000 years, because, I just want to state this again. It's unusual and strange that this book about the dawn of everything, that's called A New History of Humanity, leaves out the first 150,000 years of just Homo sapiens. And it also leaves out most of African history.
That's true.
Of humans as well. They're like, we're going to start our book about 40,000 years ago in Eurasia. And they're trying to explain to us why. And part of what's happening here, and it's happening pretty explicitly, is that, if you listen to episode 3, where we talked about the evolutionary biologists that infer things about what human life was like a couple 100,000 years ago from things like inferring cooperative childcare, our cooperative eyes, and many other pieces of evidence. In these few pages, they dispose of those theories as mythological.
Right.
And they do it by saying things like, quote, there's only so much you can reconstruct from cranial remains and the occasional piece of knapped flint, talking about the material evidence that exists about what human culture was like and what humans were up to longer ago than the period that they're considering. And they explicitly discount all of the other type of forensic evidence that anthropologists and evolutionary biologists use as just this kind of myth-making.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I get being like, look, we can't really know about that. We're not going to talk about it. I mean, that doesn't always stop them later from doing that. But talking about things they don't really know about. But, I understand that point. But I will just say that it's important to recognize that if you just ignore evolutionary biology and ignore the fact that humans are primates that ended up being quite different from other primates, and not wanting to talk about selection pressure or evolutionary processes, not want to talk about the ways that various material conditions and environmental pressures could shift how we might evolve and change,
right?
Then you are participating in a kind of exceptionalism where we treat humans very differently than we treat other animals.
Yeah.
Which has its own problems, right?
Yeah, right. I think they are guilty of that, of a kind of human exceptionalism. At one point, kind of in the middle of this chapter, they get very mad at this author for comparing early humans kind of casually with like chimps and bonobos. And they really take him to task for this, implying that like it's kind of racist even to try and learn anything about humans by comparing us to our ape relatives, And when I read that, I'm just like, I don't know if humans are as exceptional as you want them to be. Yes, we do have these special qualities, but part of the way that you learn about the implications of those qualities is by comparing it to our close relatives.
Right.
And also, I think they underestimate the degree to which chimpanzees and bonobos are also political actors.
That's true.
That form coalitions and have politics as well.
I mean, you can see that with wolf packs. You can definitely see it with cetaceans. The idea that I actually hadn't thought about it that way, that the level to which they act like humans are the only animals that do this stuff, that cooperate or who build coalitions, work against bullies, any of those things, even though we have more of that. Right. And it's more obvious.
Right. And that's an interesting thing to pry at, is like, why do we have more of that? And, all this. And there's like the social brain theory, the big brain, like all this stuff is part of trying to get to an answer to that question. But yeah, Christopher Boehm, who we talked about episode 3, has a whole chapter in his book about chimpanzees and their politics and their coalition forming, which is not as developed as human coalition forming, maybe not as complex or as nuanced, but it still exists.
Right.
And so we are on a continuum. We exist on a continuum with our more ape-like ancestors, and that's not a continuum that the Davids want to acknowledge.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Totally. Yeah. And, and this is where things get interesting because what they begin to talk about is actually how varied and different early human life was. Mm-hmm. There's ample evidence now that early humans lived at the same time as a lot of other hominids.
Yeah.
Various forms of hominids, of various sizes, different genetic material, various brain size, some more ape-like than us, some less. And even as humans moved up out of Africa into Eurasia, there were already Neanderthals there,
Yeah, and there was, I can't remember the name of the species, but there's like another hominid that they found in Southeast Asia and Indonesia. I can't remember the species, but like another, I think it was a small one, so imagine the world of people being peopled with all of these variously formed kind of humans, right? And when people talk about this, sometimes they're like, it was like Middle Earth, And we can only guess really the extent to which people, like all these different species, if you want to call them that, like communicated or shared culture as well. Although there's a lot of evidence that Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis had a lot of intercourse. Yeah, all forms.
Interaction.
Yeah.
They interacted for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Part of what they're trying to do here is show us that there's been a good amount of archaeological evidence that disrupt various commonly held ideas about prehistory and the way humans behaved and organized socially. And that's going to be the general theme of this chapter. Right. Is examining those various assumptions and the archaeological digs that trouble those assumptions.
Yes, and specifically, their main target of this is a familiar one, or one that's becoming familiar in the book, which is the egalitarian origins thesis.
Yeah, and specifically, well, definitely the egalitarian organization, absolutely, but they are maybe more convincingly going after the predominance of the tiny band as the dominant social form.
Yeah, they really go after this concept of the tiny bands.
Yes.
Which, is fine with me.
Right.
And in case you're wondering, the anthropology that I covered in the last episode, I never came across that really any of those people insist on tiny bands.
Right.
Like that part is less important.
Well, I will say this, and this is something that's often comes up in looking at this book, is that there is the academic understanding and what their colleagues are up to, and then there's the popular understanding.
Right.
And I think that there is a predominance of assumption of tiny band organization in the popular understanding of prehistory.
Yeah, you're probably right. You're probably right about that.
And so, yes, those anthropologists we were talking about last time are not proponents of tiny band dominance.
Yeah.
But I do think that the popular understanding of prehistory does think that. And whether that's because of Rousseau or just the way that different popular versions of anthropology made their way into the world and trickled down to lay people understanding, I don't know.
Yeah. No, you're right to point that out, I think, and that is very true. I personally get distracted because of how much they like insult and slander the other anthropologists, like specifically, like they're not just talking about
I know.
the popular conceptions. They're forever talking about their colleagues and scholars. Like they'll just be like, scholars say this and everything too. And so that is distracting for me. But but it's true that if we hold that a lot of what they're pushing back against are popular conceptions, that maybe, yes, the scholarship has moved on from, but the populace has still held on to some of these like older ideas, or then it makes what they're doing make a little more sense. So we promise we're going to get to the exciting stuff to talk about that is in this chapter. But speaking of shots fired against their colleagues, we should probably talk about their treatment of Christopher Bohm, because I specifically introduced y'all to Christopher Bohm's work, or maybe some of you at least, in episode 3. Christopher Bohm comes up on page 86 and 87 of the text. Bohm is the anthropologist who wrote the book called Hierarchy in the Forest. And he is the theorist of humans forming coalitions in order to resist dominance. He is the guy that's like, well, if humans lived in mostly egalitarian conditions for most of prehistory and the far Paleolithic, which the evidence seems to support, then does this mean that it is in our nature to be altruistic and peaceful? And Bohm says no, that the egalitarian conditions were the result of ongoing power struggles that, due to the conditions of the far Paleolithic, like the prevalence of nomadism and the presence of lethal weapons and like a lot of other material conditions, were able to stabilize into a condition where coalitions of people who resisted domination were able to keep the bullies and the would-be dominators in check. So they refer to Bohm in here. They give a fairly sympathetic account of his findings, which they present pretty accurately. But then they make a strange move in the second half, and this is only 2 pages of material, where they misrepresent Bohm's arguments and then take him to task for the conclusions that he reached. And the misinformation begins on page 86, where after summarizing some of the anti-authoritarian strategies, they say, quote, "This," he concludes, "is the essence of politics. The ability to reflect consciously on different directions one's society could take, and to make explicit arguments why it should take one path rather than another." Unquote. But here, this is their idea that they're putting into Bohm's mouth.
Right.
This is not Bohm's account. I read his book. This sounds like people sitting around in a circle in like a consensus meeting and making a decision about the direction that their society should take, and then agreeing to that decision. And when in fact Bohm's account is of continual struggles about power in these communities, where there's always bullies or people who try to get a little ahead or try to get a little bit of domination, who are like shamed and put down, possibly ostracized, possibly killed, in certain situations, and that the stability of the anti-authoritarian arrangements over time is the result of the constant negotiation of putting down the upstarts.
Right.
And it's not because necessarily everyone sits around and consents that this is the best way that things should go.
Yeah, like you don't get to sleep on staying free.
Yeah. Right. You don't get to sleep on staying free.
Like it actually is work.
And
that pushes...
And that's what the whole book is about,
right,
basically. But the Davids, so starting with this kind of piece of misreading, they go on and say, and so what Bohm was talking about was really important. People are self-conscious political actors. And they're like, well, you would think that if they were self-conscious political actors, then they would have had a diversity of political forms, because they tie a diversity of political forms, including hierarchy and all this stuff, to just a expression of a flowering of human creativity.
Right.
And they're like, but Bohm confusingly concludes that they never chose to do anything else besides be egalitarian. And how sad is that Bohm does not have the imagination, to see that people, of course, would want to do something else besides be egalitarian.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I know one of the parts that really stood out to me in that section was how they were like, so anyway, after he did all this work and had some good insights, he basically assumes we're all genetically Hobbesian, but culturally Rousseauian until agriculture. Which is like not what he decides at all. He doesn't think everyone's a bully, every man for himself at all. In fact, it's almost the opposite. What he says is there are always bullies.
Right.
But there are always more of us who are trying to keep the bullies at bay.
Right. Yeah. And that there is like a instinct, you might say, in humans generally that exists and can come out to dominate.
Right.
But this instinct, when the conditions are right, can be kept in check and is, by the counter instincts, which is to not be dominated. People don't want to be dominated.
Right.
either. Yeah, they say that Bohm comes to an unsettling conclusion, an odd insistence that for many tens of thousands of years, nothing happened. So this dynamic situation where people are, having to kill a guy sometimes, or, having to like not sleep on freedom.
Right.
And having to persistently maintain these egalitarian relations and failing sometimes and having male dominance sometimes and having other forms of hierarchy, because remember, Bohm documented a spectrum of egalitarianism from like hyper-egalitarianism, including gender egalitarianism, to what's called male egalitarianism, where only the males are egalitarian with each other, but the women are still like a dominated class, to like agriculture. So there's a spectrum, and it's a continual political process and an active thing. And this all looks boring to them. It's like as if nothing happened. Apparently, it's almost like unless you have institutionalized dominance hierarchies,
At least sometimes,
then nothing is happening.
Right. I know that's a really weird part. And I don't know. I mean, I know we've talked about this outside of this. It is a weird way in which their preference for certain forms of complexity means they think everything else is boring and overly simple. Even though what Bohm is describing are some complex social arrangements, and they probably got very creative in all of these ways that they kept.
Right, and they exist in a million flavors, in different forms.
And they kept hierarchy at bay in all of these different ways. And like you said, and sometimes probably failed spectacularly at that. But they think that's nothing happening, and that's their projection.
Yeah, that's right.
That's their thing, right? Yeah. And so, we are going to get on to like the more exciting stuff that's in the book, but I do think it's worth pointing out that if you're reading with us and you read that part, that's not, it's a misrepresentation of Bohm, but also it's a little bit of exposing themselves for having certain preferences. That means they don't actually see variety or innovation if it happens in more egalitarian forms.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Which is a strange predilection for an anarchist.
Yes.
I think. But, it's definitely what they're doing here.
Right.
Yeah.
And we'll see it more as we go, because we are going to cover some other social forms later in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're trying to think about why they're doing that.
Yeah, for sure.
Because I know that we can sound a little bit impatient with this stuff, but also these are smart people, and we're trying to figure out like what's going on here. Why are they being like this? I mean, even if it is unfair or it's kind of like unsupported by the evidence in some ways, or it's a misreading of Bohm and like all of this. So they are guilty of this stuff, but there's a reason, and what is the reason? So we have to think about that.
Why would anarchists want there to have always been hierarchy? And that's a question.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's a very good question. It's a very good question. And I think we can come around to something like an answer.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Or at least hazard some guesses.
Yeah.
We're getting there.
Yeah,
we're getting there.
Right.
Yeah.
And maybe we can corner David Wengrow at a party or something and try and get the answer out of him at some point.
Or we could try the Ouija board.
We could try the Ouija board. David, can you hear us?
Oh, I wish I could talk to David.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know we started with some like heavy critique, but it's because they hit us with these two things like right off the bat in the very beginning of the chapter. What we're going to talk about next is the meat of the chapter.
Yeah.
Some really cool archaeology, some really interesting anthropology. So here it comes. The authors don't like the image of the human Paleolithic being dominated by tiny egalitarian bands. So in the next part, they proceed to talk about some archaeological finds and some evidence that troubles that picture. And the first thing that they present are some burials, evidence of some pretty grand burials that have been uncovered. All of these are in Eurasia. they talk about a couple. One of them is the site called Sungir, which is in northern Russia. And they also mention Dolny Vestanice, which is in the Moravian Basin in what's now the Czech Republic. These are both burials that date from about 30,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So this is pretty good. This is pretty far back.
Right.
Like this is around the same, give or take 10,000 years around the same time as like the famous cave paintings at Altamira or Chauvet or something, right? So going way back. And these are burials where individuals or small groups of people were found buried in very elaborate ways, and sometimes elaborately dressed, buried with highly prized objects. And in the case of the Sungir burial, buried with, I don't know, something like thousands of beads.
Yeah, there are all these beads made that were crafted from mammoth tusk and fox teeth, it said, I think, or maybe that's the belt on the other person, but both of the burials they're talking about here, there's just a wild amount of beadwork that are done, and these are and they conjecture that it's like 10,000 hours of bead making.
They estimated 10,000 work hours for the Sungir beads by some estimates.
I love this idea, and it also reminded me of just something that I think is cool about some of the ideas of prehistory, and then also moving into the Neolithic, which is that I think we often think of tool use as the first working of items, or metalwork, bonework, that it's going to be spears or but often jewelry is at the very beginning as well. Like adornment comes first often.
Adornment really comes first,
and that's just really interesting and cool. And so when I saw this, when we know that they're also making stone tools and probably making bone knives and things like that, that there was all of this energy being put into ornamentation, because aside from these people that we now know were buried with thousands of beads, we can also assume that there was just beadwork happening in general, and beads being worn by the people who were moving around back then. Yeah,
and I would maybe guess that like the thousands of beads maybe weren't made specifically for the burial, but they were buried with this person. Right? Yeah. Or I think in the Sungir burial, it's maybe a couple of people, who were buried, and they were also buried with land. Yeah. There's some detail here about what they were buried with, but these were clearly like very elaborate burials at a time period in which most people were not even buried. Right. Even to be buried at all was exceptional. And then to be buried in a obviously ceremonial type fashion, or in a way that seems ceremonial to us, or to be interred with precious objects that would be precious to the people who were giving them up to bury you with them, really stands out. Yeah. And so when these finds, these very, very old burials with all this ornament and with special items interred with the people, archaeologists were like, what do we do with this? And I think you were saying that Sungir, like back in the 50s is when they started to dig that. Yeah, there's a short Wikipedia, obviously. The 1950s. You guys can tell we rely on Wikipedia a lot at the Book on Fire. When we're trying to quickly educate ourselves about something. I think it said that the dig there began in the 50s, but I don't know if like this particular burial was discovered in the 50s. It was a brief article, but the limits of our knowledge are the limits of what energy those Wikipedia drafters put into their piece. I go further sometimes. I know you did. You read the bone book. I read the bone book. Big. I read about the Eskimos for this episode. Anyway, but these princely burials they call. So there's the Sungir and the Dolny Vestanice. Those are the oldest ones. They also talk about a couple other burials in France. This guy who they call Il Principe, because he's buried almost like a prince would be buried, right? And so, so these burials raise a question, right? And the question is, like what's going on? Who are these people? Who are these people? Or like, what were the circumstances that led to these burials? And we're used to, archaeologically speaking, we're like used to thinking about elaborate burials in the context of hierarchical social arrangements. Right. Like, King Tut or something like that. It leads to the very understandable question is like, well, does this mean that these were hierarchical societies? Were these people who were buried in this way, were they Were they like maybe not kings, but were they leaders in some way? Were they people with authority? And if this is 30,000 years ago, then now do we need to start thinking about there being hierarchical societies happening back then rather than nomadic egalitarian bands, whatever, right?
And in fact, a lot of the archaeologists and theorists who first begin to consider these burials did make that assumption. They would say, so here we have evidence of hierarchy. And
by analogy with these other burials that were in fact kings because we know that they were.
And they could point to it and say like, so there's always been hierarchy. You know?
Right.
And it's interesting because David spent a little bit of time saying like, well, we don't really know that. So they point out that there are not other signs of hierarchy, like not accumulations of wealth or other grand buildings or something alongside
fortifications or, just things like that.
But also, interestingly, a large percentage of these burials are people who are physically anomalous.
Yeah.
And they mentioned that in the Romero site.
The Ramito Cave. Yeah, right.
In the Ramito Cave that was mentioned earlier in the book. But that often these people have visible physical anomalies, whether it's dwarfism or having some sort of physical frame that looks different from at the skeletal level, right?
Yeah, you can tell from the skeleton.
So that's significant.
That these were anomalous people. And to be clear, we're not talking about very many burials that are being looked at here. It's like maybe a dozen, but still it's striking how many of the people seem to be anomalous in some way.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting because if you wanted to say these were the leaders, or this is clearly a king, or there's hereditary royalty or something.
Right.
Because sometimes it's children.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
It's weird that there's a high preponderance of physical anomaly.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the things that they point out is that like it's possible that if you want to really go into this anomaly thing, people can be anomalous in ways that are not preserved by the archaeological evidence.
Yeah, they won't show up in the skeletal
remains.
It
wouldn't show up in the skeletal remains, like someone might be an albino or like very neurodivergent in some way. So it's possible that even more of these elaborate burials represent atypical people.
Yeah. As an aside to this, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail on this part, but if you're interested in this stuff and the idea that unusual people might be treasured or like have a special place in various cultures. And in prehistory, there is a longer section that talks about more recent ethnographies, things that are not based on archaeology, but are actually based on fieldwork that show a common pattern of people who are unusual having special roles in the culture. And I think it's worth pointing that out because, I don't know, sometimes when I talk to different people about prehistory or about different ways of life before like quote unquote civilization or something, or people who live outside the state. Yeah. There can be kind of an assumption that differently abled folks, people who have cognitive differences or are unusual, there wouldn't be a place for them in traditional cultures. And the evidence actually is the opposite of that. For one thing, I would say that whatever in this like overdeveloped West, there is not a lot of space made for differently abled folks at all. Yeah. In fact, there's a large group of the population who are treated as disposable, which we've seen as we've moved through COVID. But also, there's a lot of evidence that traditional peoples around the world actually not only have space for eccentric people or for special people or people who are not what we would think of as typical in a lot of ways, and that there's actually special roles or allowance for those folks, and there's a lot of tolerance. And that people who might not be able to go out and get their own food are often taken care of. Yeah, right. And so this is some more
which is kind of a revolutionary observation because it's like, because a very chauvinistic way of being a member of the modern world would assume that in prehistoric times, people who were disabled would just be like left to die or whatever, and we don't find this to really be the case, at least let's say it the other way. We find this to not have been the case frequently,
actually I hadn't thought about that the way it contradicts fascism and like people like Avila or someone traditionalist who are celebrating the mythic past the
Yeah.
heroic masculine mythic past,
Yeah.
and who have a pretty eugenicist concept
Mm-hmm.
of prehistory and what culture should be like,
Right.
actually are have to
And survival of the fittest.
survival of the fittest, all of
Yeah.
that. Yeah, the social Darwinism.
Mm-hmm.
Then that's ignoring actually the long breadth of history and what
Yeah.
we actually see evidence of, which
Yeah.
is care
Mm-hmm.
for people
Yeah.
and mutual care, which we
Yeah.
talked about this in another episode too. But it is true that here we're seeing like more of these
Yeah.
burials
Yeah.
that show us that. I mean, okay, so I'm projecting my own shit onto this. Let's say that too, because honestly, these people could have been sacrificial victims. We have no idea.
Yeah, we really don't know.
We don't know,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
we do know that there's bodies that were clearly people who were kept alive
Uh-huh.
through the group support sometimes.
Right.
And
Right, because they weren't all children.
because they're not all children. And so there is some evidence. But
And the Davids draw a line.
Yeah.
This is what Janet was talking about a minute ago. The Davids draw a line from these burials to, like, specifically a really interesting section on what are called the Nuer prophets. The Nuer are a nomadic herding tribe in Africa, East Africa, that are very well known, very well studied. And during a certain period of time, there rose in their society a very special and high status role for these prophets who were very eccentric individuals, but were also had some power to lead.
Mm-hmm.
The Nuer prophets is actually a really interesting phenomenon, and the book only really scratches the surface of what they're all about. But they're using that as like a more contemporary example of how eccentric or atypical individuals could have a special place.
Yeah. So while some people were seeing these burials as evidence of hierarchy, the Davids argue that there's not a ton of evidence. At least here, they're arguing that there's not, that there could be some other social organizations going on, and we don't actually know, but that it's worth noting that special people, a lot of these people were special in various ways. And, but what we can at least say is that there was probably a coordination of groups of individuals to create the artifacts that were found in these burial sites.
Right. It seems to speak to like more than just a band of a dozen people burying one of their own, right? If there's 10,000 beads, or maybe I'm confusing the number of beads with the 10,000 hours that it took to make the beads.
Right. Thousands of beads
But,
made over 10,000 hours.
Yeah. But, you know, if all this went into the burials, it seems to speak to some kind of larger happening.
Right.
That maybe involved more people, you know?
Yeah.
And speaking of coordination between larger groups of people, the next thing that they turn to after these elaborate burials are examples of like pretty large scale building projects that once again trouble the idea of small nomadic bands, right? That seem to, or must have been, the effort of larger groups of coordinated people. And the most spectacular of these is the now pretty famous site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. And Göbekli Tepe is actually not an Ice Age site, but Göbekli Tepe is definitely anomalous for being a series of stone temples, like basically, you know, like carved in stone with relief depictions of animals. And I mean, a very, you know, the kind of thing that we are used to seeing from all around the world, but in much later societies. And these temples were all erected in a single hill in what's now southeastern Turkey, kind of right near the border between Turkey and Syria, starting in 9000 BC by hunter-gatherers. Like, there is no evidence that the people who worked on Göbekli Tepe were agricultural people. They were probably semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers. They lived partially off of the wild grains of the region, you know, which were the same grains that right around the corner and at about the same time were being domesticated by humans in more of like the Mesopotamian region. You know, so it's kind of coextensive in time with the domestication of grains, and these people ate grains, but it was like the wild grains. And also just the abundant fauna and the wild pistachios and stuff that grew on the Anatolian plateau at this time. I really like to think about what these people's way of life was like. But like massive stone temples. If you don't know about Göbekli Tepe already, look up some pictures.
Oh yeah,
learn
so
about
beautiful.
Göbekli Tepe.
Because there's these like T-post pillars that have all of these different animals in relief on them, and they're really beautifully done. It's impressive.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's something that
there's vultures, serpents.
Oh yeah,
and,
alligator,
alligators.
Oh no, crocodile probably.
Yeah, there's a crocodile on there. Yeah.
They're all very impressive, and there's a lot of conjecture about what they were for. There's definitely people who think they were for star watching, but the Davids argue what a lot of archaeologists say, which is that there's a likelihood that there might have been a wooden roof on many of these kinds of sites.
Right, even though they do seem to be oriented towards like Orion and Sirius come up sometimes.
There's a directionality to them that seems to be at least connected to the celestial bodies somewhat. We're going to talk about Göbekli Tepe later.
Beer. They drank beer.
But we will go into more depth with this site later, right? Because they're... It's going to come up in a few chapters.
Yeah, it does come up in a couple of chapters again. Yeah.
But it was an exciting find because, this idea of like these nomadic bands, which was the predominant popular understanding and possibly even academic at this point of the time period, this is a sign of massive cooperation.
Yeah.
It's a monumental site.
Yeah, like serious monumental
actual monumental architecture. There are multiple sort of temple cavern type things, or at least like openings, enclosures, right? And it would have taken a good bit of work to do this.
Yeah.
And it seems to have been coordinated, to have happened or emerged out of these times of abundance when there are a lot of people around. And there is no obvious sign of hierarchy or settlement from the people who built this site.
Yeah, there's no signs of settlement.
Yeah.
There's no signs of settlement, and all of the food remains and stuff were all wild food. There's like tons of wild animal bones and stuff that have been analyzed. It's pretty cool. I mean, this is a very intensively studied site, partially because it is so, it's so interesting, right? Because it really troubles this notion that first we were nomadic hunter-gatherers, and then we started doing agriculture, and then agriculture made possible the types of hierarchical organization that could assemble these workforces to create things like pyramids and temples for religious purposes. There's a story in which all of that goes together, right? It's like nomadic bands, and then one day agriculture, and then agriculture changes everything because it makes there be more people, it requires more people, they're sedentary, and the people need like a religion to like track the seasons and to keep the workforce in line and to have a reason to go through all of this stuff. And then there's priests, and then the priests organize these building projects that result in, temples and pyramids and all of these things. And now at Göbekli Tepe, you have a building project kind of like that, but
no signs of
no agriculture.
Yeah.
Even just the no agriculture part flips the script,
Right.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned already that they had beer, like part of what's found there are these big vats.
Yeah.
That seem to be fermentation vats.
Yeah.
And they think they were fermenting the grains there to drink. The wild grain.
Right.
Specifically. Not the cultivated grain.
Yeah.
And so it does seem like a party zone. Whether or not it's a ceremonial party zone, like this is what we're not sure of.
Yeah.
But it's an exciting site to think about. And
even though the people who built it were not farming people, it's still, I think it's interesting, like it's part of this Eastern Mediterranean grain experimentation culture too, because like in this part, they were potentially fermenting wild grains and making beer. Around the corner of the Mediterranean, a little further south, they were actually domesticating grains and starting, the culture of wheat and bread and like all of this. And so there was just in this part, and there's people who were getting more settled and becoming agricultural who were experimenting with grains. So anyway, I just like to think about this like grain experimentation sphere. Geographical sphere, that there was a lot of different ways to participate in, and not only through the domestication of grain either.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so there's Göbekli Tepe. Okay, not quite an Ice Age site, but still very interesting, anomalous. asks a lot of questions or begs a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Also, what they talk about in this chapter are
the mammoth houses.
and this actually is going back further in time,
Oh, yeah.
are what they call the mammoth houses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And these are between 25 and 12,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
In Europe, there's a string of sites between Krakow and Kiev.
Yeah, there's these somewhat massive. I mean, I have to say that when I looked at pictures, I might not have called them monumental, and they kind of say, like, what is monumental?
Yeah, they call all of this, all these examples to them are examples of monumental architecture, but the mammoth houses,
they're a little bit, they're impressive, but I don't know if I would have called them monumental. But anyway, there are these large structures that are made of mammoth bones and tusks, basically, and some wood. I think there's also some wood there, and they lasted until the present. They're being, dug out because they are made of bone.
Yeah, they're apparently very carefully constructed with like a lot of skill about the stretching of skins, right? Because their skeletons of these structures are made out of like mammoth bones and things, and maybe some pieces of wood, but then stretched over that is skins and all. And they say like the largest of which, just so you can get a sense of the scale, the largest of them are 39 feet in diameter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty big.
Yeah, so bigger than would be like the house of a family or something. And there's not actually evidence that they were dwellings, but that other things were going on inside them.
Right, so maybe they were ritual spaces. We don't really know. The conjecture is that these were built when a lot of people came together, big groups of people were gathering to collectively hunt mammoth together.
Right. Or collectively eat.
And eat. Right. So the carcasses that these bones were taken from would be enough meat to feed several hundred people for 4 months or something. Like, it's that quantity of meat. And so, yes, this was like a celebratory thing. And that's what I kind of like to picture is like maybe like you killed a bunch of mammoth with your group. So a lot of bands come together possibly, or you have like a meetup.
Right.
Because people are able to get more mammoth with more coordination and more people.
Yeah.
And then as you're hanging out, processing the meat, processing the hides, eating the meat, feasting and celebrating, you also have this like pretty cool art project happening. Where you like build an elaborate structure that does take some technical skill and know-how to make work.
And for something to go on inside.
Which is probably ritual. Or
but
maybe...
presumably, I mean, even in one 39 feet across, like how many people, I feel like we're talking about more people than would fit inside a 39
That's true.
structure.
That's true.
So what's
happening?
What's going on in there? Yeah.
And one thing that this makes me think about is the way that when you read about prehistory and even the history of mass extinction, there's always this emphasis on tools or on certain people, and they'll say, like the Clovis people, they had this certain kind of point, they had this certain kind of capacity for hunting, and that allowed them to kill more animals.
Yeah.
And that led to the extinction of the megafauna, right? But what the mammoth houses makes me think of is that coordination and certain levels of coordination and cooperation is also a technology.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to celebrate the extinction of the megafauna, but I just want to say that I often see the tools as being the emphasis and not the techniques.
Yeah. Right.
And so...
Yeah, like although the people who used Clovis points to hunt also needed very specific hunting techniques to bring down these very large animals too. Yeah, so that's what you're saying.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying is that what we're seeing at this point is there was likely a flourishing of cooperation happening as well. It had the deadly
on
end.
Different scales.
Absolutely.
Too, like small scale cooperation when people were roaming the landscape and hunting in that way, and then larger scale cooperation in these aggregation times when people had the ability to build these more monumental or larger or ritual structures in some way. Yeah. And that then becomes like part of the interpretation of not just these monumental sites, but also potentially the elaborate burials as well, is that perhaps these sites are associated with periodic or seasonal aggregations of people. Like they don't represent sites of permanent occupation, but that rather these were sites that were maybe the mammoth houses were used year after year the same structure. You would maybe have to reskin it periodically. And then so a picture starts to emerge of people in the Upper Paleolithic, or in the case of Göbekli Tepe, living in the early Holocene, but pre-agricultural people who maybe, they were hunter-gatherers still, and maybe spent part of the year dispersed on the landscape, hunting in various ways, but then, just based on the the seasonal shifts or the migration of game, people would congregate temporarily in these particular sites where more organized activity could take place.
Right.
And then maybe the burials even too are the result of this. Like when there's more people together, more culture tends to happen.
Oh, right.
That is kind of a little bit of a law of anthropology potentially too, or it's a theory. Even to this day, that's like part of the reason why like cities are like associated with culture, because like just people encountering each other tends to produce creative effusion. And so in the times of the year when people would be congregating, these rituals would take place, building projects would take place, sculpture, temples, maybe elaborate burials, all of these things. Because just going back to the burials, there is some evidence that the David's kind of sketch, it's kind of tenuous, but the site of the burials seems to be, and once again, there's not very many of these that they're drawing from, but the site of them seems to be coincident with places where Paleolithic game were in their annual migrations. There's like choke points in the migration of game where like a lot of the elk have to funnel through this one pass in the mountains, and so people would gather there to pick them off and hunt them, and so a lot of people would be gathering there.
Right.
And some of these elaborate burials are found in just such a place.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. What they want to draw from these sites is largely that people got around a lot more, that the tiny band as the primary social organizational form is limiting, and that there's a lot of evidence that that was not the predominant form, or at least that people met up in big groups sometimes.
Yeah.
And so they see these sites as really exciting as evidence that humans were up to more than just traveling around with a small group.
Yeah, we can modify our idea. If we had internalized this idea of small nomadic bands as typical of the Paleolithic, then, at least in the time period that they're talking about here, hard to say before that, but at least in the time period that we're talking about here, we can modify that picture by thinking about people who were in nomadic bands part of the time, but then would periodically congregate and have like a different thing going on, and this is like, this is not hard to relate to.
Right. And they don't really talk about this, but it would likely be tied to ecology. It would be tied to abundance of fruit and nuts, or or the grain harvest, wild grains, or tied to animal migration.
Yeah.
And so there was, and this will lead into the next part, a sort of seasonality of these aggregations of people. And because they're tied to their environment.
Yeah.
Whether or not they come out and say that here. That is part of what's going on with these groupings of people.
Totally, yeah. Janet and I actually went to this site in Georgia, like the United State of Georgia. No, wait. The state of the United States.
Georgia. The southeastern
Georgia
state.
In the USA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish we could go to the other Georgia. I would go to the other Georgia. Maybe not right now.
We'd gone to Florida, and we were on our way back, and we swung through this site in Georgia that's like it's like right off the Chattahoochee River, right? I think almost on the border with Alabama, in a very rural part of Georgia. And it's called Colamaki, the Colamaki Mounds, and it's a state park. And there's still existing there like a number of earthen mounds, and most of them are pretty small, but one of them is quite tall.
It's big.
Like, would you say it was 5 stories tall?
Yeah.
At least.
Yeah.
And there's wooden stairs now that they've built that you can walk up to the top. But the big mound exists in front of like a large kind of festival grounds is what it looks like. It's basically just a large cleared field, and they keep it mowed and everything now. But it very much has a feel of like, okay, like lots of people are gathered in this big open area, like an outdoor concert or something, where the stage is at one end, except the stage is the big mound, and then there's this big field where people congregate. And then there's other auxiliary mounds. But the Kalamaki site is a site that was in use from, I think, the first millennium AD. Is that right?
Yeah.
I feel like it goes back that far, like maybe 500 or 600 AD, which is a pretty old site in the history of North American, mound sites, right? A lot of the mound sites in the Southeast that we are used to are associated with like the Mississippian culture, which came about much later than this site. And from what they've pieced together from the evidence, unfortunately, the site has not been studied, as much as we would like, maybe. But this was a seasonal
gathering
spot that drew people from, all the way down into what's now Florida, from the coastal areas, from all around. And it's positioned very conveniently to, I forget what they called it. I have the book over there on the bookshelf because I got a book about it, but it's like this line on the landscape. I want to call it like the nut line or something, but there's like a lot of nut-bearing trees that form like a belt on the landscape right there.
Including pecans.
Including
lots of pecans.
And hickories of various kinds and pecans and acorns. So maybe it's associated, I mean, it's kind of hard to say, but potentially it's associated with
nut harvest.
The nut harvest, and we don't know what went on there, but there was a big mound, but it wasn't a city. It wasn't like Cahokia, which is a site that comes up kind of later in the book that's on the Mississippi River, where the central mounds are at the center of a large like settlement, like basically a city. There were maybe some people who lived there as kind of like caretakers of the site, but it wasn't a village, really. It was a place to congregate.
Yeah, they've mostly just found evidence of it being a big gathering spot. And there was probably some amount of ritual there, like who knows, but it doesn't have much evidence at all except of like a place for people to meet up and share in the abundance of the nut harvest. And possibly game too. Maybe it would have been a time to be tracking animals through there. But I will say that that's, for one thing, it's a nice place to visit. It's extremely underfunded state park and it has a museum that's extremely out of date with explaining what's going on there. But
unfortunately,
but it was really nice to be there and just to be in a spot where there would have been these like joyous gatherings of people, and colonization is so far into the future that it's not even in there. You can't even smell it there, except that there's a state park there, right?
Right.
There's something nice about visiting a indigenous spot of Turtle Island that's come so far before the rest of like the tragic haunted history of this land.
Yeah, that's right. It's like 1,000 years before Columbus.
Right. Yeah. So if you're in that area, I recommend going. For sure. And we got to see a gopher tortoise. So that was cool.
That's true. Yeah, right. So, but to bring it back, part of what they're pointing out here is that we need to think about people in these like seasonal oscillations, and they have a more didactic point that they're trying to make with this too. But the basic point is that it's good to start thinking about hunter-gatherers as frequently congregating to do stuff.
And having the capacity for, and maybe even tendency towards cooperation, collaboration, and highly organized structure building, possibly, or collaboration on a grand scale.
Group projects of different kinds, Yeah,
because Kalamakia, I can't remember how many thousands of buckets of dirt it talked about it would take to make it, but it was a lot.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely
a big project.
A massive project. Yeah. And continuing on the theme of this seasonal rhythms of people periodically congregating in certain areas, and this kind of thing like we've been talking about, the chapter also has a whole pretty extended section, which is important to what they're trying to do, in which they give us examples of indigenous people in historical times, in fact, fairly recent historical times, who live in such a way where there is this type of seasonal variation or seasonality. And they're talking about, the contemporary people, or like the more contemporary people, on the possibility that it could give us a window into what this prehistoric life could have been like, because we've taken notice of these kind of oscillations in prehistory where people gather and then not, and they kind of are doing one thing at one part of the year and then another thing at a different part of the year, at least two, and the Davids are like, oh, it's, that's interesting because we actually see that a lot in these ethnographies. It's actually not uncommon of a feature. And they kind of make a big deal out of like how no one talks about this anymore. And it's kind of like this forgotten part of anthropology, which I don't think is totally true, but whatever. The examples are all like really interesting.
Definitely.
For instance, the famous anthropologist Marcel Mauss had a very strong interest in this type of seasonal variation. He called it double morphology. Tribes that could form themselves into two different forms, a double morphology. And Mauss, along with Henri Bouchat, did an extensive study of the circumpolar Inuit, and they published a book called Seasonal Variations of the Eskimo, which I actually perused yesterday. It was published in 1903. What they report on is that the Inuit people, at least at the time that they were being documented over 100 years ago,
1800s or so,
basically had two social structures that they lived in at different times of the year. The summertime was the time of year when the animals that they hunted, the seals and stuff, were more dispersed and widely spread out. And so the Inuit would live, they were basically it was like one family at a time. The camps were a man and his wife and their unmarried children. So this was the group that you were in the summertime. And at this time of year, when people were more dispersed, more isolated in these nuclear families, it was a very patriarchal time where the father just had total command. They say during this period, property was possessively marked and patriarchs exercised coercive, sometimes even tyrannical power over their kin.
Right.
But then in the winter months, the long winter months, when the seals and walrus flocked to the Arctic shore, there was a dramatic reversal. I'm actually reading from the book now. Then Inuit gathered together to build great meeting houses of wood, whale rib, and stone, and within these houses, virtues of equality, altruism, and collective life prevailed. Wealth was shared, and husbands and wives exchanged partners under the aegis of Sedna, the goddess of the sea. Yeah, it sounds nice.
Well, especially when you think about how long the winter was exactly. I mean, we're talking like 9 months.
Yeah.
So at least. So,
yeah, right.
That's interesting. And those houses sound a lot like the mammoth houses.
Yeah, I feel like they were similar constructions. And then in the book by Mauss, it's really describing the life inside these houses is pretty nice. Like there might be like an old dude who like kind of presides over everything inside like one of these houses in which like a very large extended family and related people would be gathered for the whole winter. But that person is mainly like, he doesn't really have any real command. It's just a benevolent force that sort of just puts his blessing over everything and makes sure that everybody has what they need, and there's plenty of food and it's all shared and there's an atmosphere of just good cheer and laughter and camaraderie, and there's even this part where he's like, and then when the lanterns go out, the orgies begin. And you gotta wonder like,
Wow.
Yeah. So since I read part of this book like yesterday and everything, I think there's a couple things that I want to come back to about this maybe later, when we're being a little bit more reflective about all of this. But yeah, but this is a very clear example of seasonal variation. And this is why Maus pulled this out. It couldn't be more different. You know, in one time of the year, it was like this big communal, very warm, not just temperature warm, but like socially warm atmosphere where there was very little property. Everything was shared, almost like the nuclear family itself kind of dissolved. Yeah. And then in the summertime, the nuclear family and a patriarchal nuclear family was like all that there was, basically. So Eskimo. And then they get into a little bit more extended account of what they call the Buffalo Police.
Oh, yeah. The Buffalo Police are an example of seasonal variation within some of the indigenous folks in the Great Plains area in the 19th century. And
so 19th century, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this was recorded and discussed in the anthropology world mostly by Robert Lowy. And he did his own field work with the Mandan, Hidatsu, and Crow people in so-called Wyoming and Montana. But he was really, really interested in the records and stories of the mostly Cheyenne and Lakota folks in the 19th century. And the different social structures they would bring into place temporarily when it was time for a big buffalo hunt.
Yeah.
And
yeah, this is wild.
It's such a wild story.
Yeah.
So what they would do would be to sort of appoint different members of a clan, and the clan the Buffalo Police would change every year, so the same families would not be able to keep power. And they would appoint folks to be sort of enforcement of
all kinds of
the
things.
Hunt. But yeah, so the things that they were trying to do would be to like coordinate the hunters, keep the hunters on point. So if anybody tried to start a little war party and run off and go do something else, they could be brought back and disciplined.
Yeah.
And these people had
coercive power.
They were able, and they would use violence sometimes.
The buffalo hunt was a really, as you might imagine, it was a very important event in the life of all these people.
Yeah.
And it seems like the vibe was like,
we have to
don't fuck this up.
Right.
So people who were like having feuds and starting squabbles and stuff like with each other would be disciplined.
Absolutely. Yeah. Or if you ran off to go do something else, you could be brought back and disciplined.
Yeah.
And again, just to place this in time, so this is when these folks had redomesticated horses that had escaped from the Spanish. And so they're on horseback for these buffalo hunts.
Right.
For the most part.
Yeah. These were folks who kind of interestingly had been more sedentary agricultural people.
Right.
Who, once they had access to these horses, that had escaped from the Spanish, gone feral, and then that they were able to redomesticate, largely gave up agriculture and became nomadic hunters again.
Yeah, that part is really interesting too. Especially because as an aside, like there's a lingering idealization of a certain phase of indigenous life on Turtle Island that settlers have. Yeah. And it's very much this like very specific time of Plains Indian culture.
Right. Yeah.
Of horseback.
Yeah.
Hunting. As if that had gone back into time immemorial when like actually life was very different, and that was a post-colonial contact.
Yeah.
Change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, just to say that.
But a lot of people don't know that.
Right. I guess that's true.
It's interesting.
It is really interesting. But yes, they're a good example in several ways of how adaptive humans are, right? So they're just like, actually, we're going to live this way now. We have this other resource.
Yeah, right.
And so...
And there's nothing backwards about that.
Right. Yeah, so they're a great example of that fluidity.
Against Turgeot and this
moving,
kind of...
it's not progressive stages. Right. It's fluidity and horizontal movement sometimes and just choosing life ways that make sense at the time.
Yeah, exactly.
And so they would go on these big hunts, and there were Buffalo Police appointed for this. I mean, who knows if they really called them police, but they had coercive power. And another thing that they would discipline people for is if someone tried to claim food or meat for themselves and hoard food as their own private property, they were disciplined for that. So it's kind of interesting because what I think of as police is protecting private property.
Right, but they were enforcing sharing.
They were enforcing communal property, or
Yeah.
like the sharing of property and policing privatization.
Yeah, interesting.
So there's an inversion there as well.
Yeah.
But so they not only had these forces that would come into place just for the time of the hunt, but then afterwards they would disband. And as I mentioned already, these tribes would rotate who was going to be the police every hunt so that no one accumulated power over time. And then that power would disband, and they would not have no one would have the coercive power again. It would go back to more of the ways of life that we talked about back in the Candy Orang section, where there was not as much institutional power in general. Even though it's a really different part of the country and a different group of people.
Yeah.
There still was not evidence of regular life coercive institutional state.
Yeah, they
government.
made it sound like, or the authors, quoting Robert Lowy, make it sound like, I think that there's a quote in the book, it's like the tribe almost didn't exist in the other time of the year. Like, there wasn't much of a collective life.
There wasn't a collective life as much. Yeah, it's interesting. And again, this is at a point where colonization was in full swing. A lot of violence had already happened. And they're on the part of the colonizers. And there had already been a good amount of disease that had hit the indigenous populations as well. So who knows what all else was going on. But we can at least, the record at least says that there was this concentrated movement and activity during the buffalo hunt times, and then much less coordination in the off season.
And the authors don't explore this, but you would imagine that there's some kind of like seasonal variation in the ecosystem, like in the world that the humans were inhabiting that governed the seasonality of these two different
That's true.
poles. Like maybe there was a optimal time of year for the buffalo hunt
Right.
to be happening. And so this is, so, I mean, because usually this is what's going on. Like the people aren't just like arbitrarily being like, how about we do this half a year? All right. Like, which half do you think? Oh, I don't know. Well, let's do it in the spring or whatever. I kind of want to do it in the fall. No, it's like they're taking these social forms because it's what their way of life kind of demands. Like I was saying about the Eskimo, it's like the seals disperse, and so the people disperse.
Right.
And then the seals and the walruses are more congregated, and the people are more congregated, It's like this type of thing is what governs that usually.
Yeah, and it seems like that's one of the takeaways I got from this whole section is that, in general, I mean, they don't emphasize the environs connection very much, again, but there is this idea that sometimes it's expedient to have more hierarchy. And it makes more sense. And I think like most of us have been in situations where like, say there's like an emergency. It's good to have someone who can keep their cool, who can kind of organize people and tell people what to do, who is able to deal with like a high pressure situation.
Right.
And not all of us are made for that.
Right.
And so it kind of reminded me of just that kind of thing where like when you're in an intense situation, it can be helpful to have temporary leadership. And we don't always
temporary authority or
temporary
something.
authority.
Yeah. And there's every reason to believe that people have been creating temporary leadership or even hierarchies of expedience, like always.
Right.
And that they're like voluntarily kind of engaged in. And this is something that actually would be really helpful in the book in general, especially in this chapter, for Graeber and Wengrow to like articulate the difference that you just did, which is the difference between a voluntary hierarchy, which is what you were just talking about, where people are like, okay, we're going on a hunt. Like there's like a hunting party and you are going to lead this hunt, and so for whatever reason, you might want to appoint somebody as the leader, but then once you get back to camp from the hunt, they have no power anymore, right? It's just like a temporary expedient. And it's a voluntary situation. And that's really different from a dominance hierarchy, more conventionally thought of, where somebody like actually has coercive power, where the people who are dominated are actually stuck in that position. Like they're not consenting to it.
Right.
It's actually a very important distinction to make.
Right.
And in the chapter, the reader would benefit a lot from being able to like have this distinction in mind
Right.
as they're reading through some of these examples. But there might be, I mean, it's possible that Graeber and Wengrow are actually like, they're thriving from the confusion that's created between these things because, and it has to do with what all of this means to them.
Right.
What they're trying to do. Because what they're saying with like the quote unquote, the Buffalo Police, they're trying to say that like, hey, maybe it's normal for people to experience hierarchy part of the time, right? Like maybe this is a normal part of life, actually.
Right.
And maybe if we see seasonality, you know, just in these few examples among the Kwakiutl, the Inuit, the Namaquara are in the book, but we didn't talk about them, and with the Buffalo Police, and we see evidence of seasonality in the prehistoric examples of the burials, the mammoth houses, all of this, that we can maybe infer that at one of these poles of seasonal oscillation was like a more free time, and one of them was a more structured or hierarchical or something time, that maybe like this actually goes all the way back in history as far as we can see.
Right.
And so like if we take this, if we're following them this far, which, you know, there's some ifs in there, like maybe because maybe not all seasonal variation is between hierarchy and something else. You know, like we don't know that. Like we don't know that Göbekli Tepe was like hierarchical when they were building the stone temples. But the Davids kind of like to think it was.
Yeah, that's a really strange thing that happens in there.
Or they want to like entertain that possibility. Like they're like, hey, this is monumental architecture. That means maybe hierarchy, you know? And that means that maybe these people, even far back in prehistory, they weren't just living in tiny egalitarian bands. They had they knew hierarchy part of the year. And then they like dissolved it or walked away from it, you know? And they make a lot out of thinking through this possibility. Like they're like, whoa, what if people have just always had hierarchy and knew hierarchy and then walked away from it and dissolved it and did something else for part of the year and then created again and came back, you know? And to them, that there's something freeing about that. And so they'll say things like about the Buffalo Police, they'll be like, well, these people lived in what the categories of anthropology would almost call a state with a police force like modern states have for part of the year. And then they were like nomadic hunter-gatherers living in egalitarian bands for the other part of the year. You know, and what does that mean? That people could just like shift back and forth every year, their whole life, between living in something like a state and then living in something like Rousseau's hunter-gatherer bands. But to say that living under the Buffalo Police, or not under the Buffalo Police, but
with that
living with the Buffalo Police as an institution is like a state, is to equate that to dominance hierarchy.
Right.
You know?
Right. Instead of voluntary.
Coercive, unchosen dominance hierarchy, when potentially the Buffalo Police was like a voluntarily consented to institution that was done for expedience, like you're talking about.
Right.
You know, and we would benefit from being able to consider these separately instead of conflating them. But it actually kind of strengthens, I think, where they're trying to go with it.
Right.
To sort of mush these two together.
Yeah, I guess that must be why, because it is confusing that they keep doing that.
So like I said, the Davids are using these contemporary examples of seasonal variations of people going in and out of hierarchical forms as a model for what might have existed in the Ice Age, in prehistory. In fact, they think that it's likely that prehistory was full of just these types of forms.
I mean, and it is true that the seasonal changes, that even like just the global shifts in the climate and moving back and forth of just living around glaciation would have
incentivized seasonality of some kind. Yeah, that makes total sense. But the name of this chapter, right, the the subtitle is In and Out of Chains, the Protean Possibilities, right? So what they're highlighting here is not just that people were different in different times of the year, or that they lived like differently, like they ate fish at one time and they ate meat at the other time, but that they had different political structures, right? But as we were saying, they give us kind of a confused sense of what the nature of these different political structures were that people were maybe moving back and forth between. Like, going back to the Ice Age, right, which is the main topic of the chapter, Unfreezing the Ice Age, they've showed us these elaborate burials, and we talked about the mammoth houses and Göbekli Tepe, and they've made a case that these were places of seasonal aggregations of people.
And of collaborative labor.
So they've pointed out all of this, but then still, in the context of all of that, I was really surprised to see a couple statements in the chapter that really stood out to me. One of them is on page 92, which is kind of at the end of their exposition of Göbekli Tepe and the mammoth houses, where it says, it's kind of a concluding paragraph, and they're taking stock of everything that's on display. And they say, evidence of institutional inequality in Ice Age societies, whether grand burials or monumental buildings, is sporadic. And then they have a paragraph there about how this is actually a pretty sporadic archaeological record. But what I noted there is that they're calling it evidence of institutional inequality, which to me it sounds like when they're talking about that stuff, they have usually not jumped to that conclusion.
Yeah, they've actually given a decent amount of evidence or examples of why that one doesn't need to assume that.
Yeah, counter examples, like maybe these people who were buried looking like kings were unusual individuals that potentially had no power in the culture, but were significant for other reasons. They've actually introduced all this other stuff that would complicate the notion that these are just evidence of institutional inequality. Right? So this is very confusing to me. And then it comes up again on page 111, which is closer to the end of the chapter, where they say, meanwhile, as we've seen, archaeological evidence is piling up to suggest that in the highly seasonal environments of the last Ice Age, our remote ancestors were behaving much like the Inuit, the Navaquara, or the Crow. They shifted back and forth between alternative social arrangements, building monuments and then closing them down again, allowing the rise of authoritarian structures during certain times of the year, then dismantling them. And I just am surprised to see this because they have not really shown that this was evidence of authoritarianism, of authoritarian structures. I mean, even part of the year. Like, they haven't shown that Göbekli Tepe required a hierarchical authoritarian structure to be built. You can see something like that, a vast project that may have taken multiple years to build, and assume that there was some kind of structure of coordination there, and that it's not hard to imagine that being hierarchical, but there's not actually evidence of hierarchy. Right. And I think that what really struck me when reflecting on this is that, like, when I first learned about Göbekli Tepe, and that hunter-gatherers who had no agriculture and ate only wild foods created these amazing stone temples, I think that, like, the anarchist in me, kind of at the back of my mind, if anything, I did not want to rush to the conclusion that this implied hierarchy.
Right.
Because I was like, well, maybe this was possible without hierarchy.
Right.
Because there's no evidence of hierarchy, unlike, the stone monuments of Egypt or something, right? And so maybe this is like an exception that breaks the mold, that, that monumental stone constructions entailed hierarchy. But the Davids here, also with a anarchistic, type of bent, are letting us think that maybe this was a sign of hierarchy.
Without actually presenting a case for that.
Without presenting the evidence for that, right? But clearly what they're doing here is somewhat confused, even on their own terms, because they themselves offer a lot of counter arguments. Like, maybe this is just pageantry. Like, this is another one of the things that comes up. Like, maybe these were just kings for a day in some kind of, like, ritual pomp and circumstance or whatever that, like, really had no coercive effect on these people's lives. Not kings for a day necessarily at Göbekli Tepe, but talking about some of the burials and things. Like, in each of these cases, except for I guess except for Göbekli Tepe, but in almost all the cases, they bring up all these other things that could be going on besides a dominance hierarchy.
And they also bring up the absence of evidence of hierarchy. There's like not other pileups of ornamental goods or wealth, or there's no evidence of the kinds of things you see alongside other monumental architecture when there is hierarchy.
That's true. Yeah. And actually I was mentioning this to Janet, is further on in the book, they have a whole chapter on the possibility of egalitarian, non-hierarchical early cities that happened in prehistory.
Right.
And in that chapter, the lack of evidence for hierarchy is taken to mean that there was likely not to be hierarchy.
Right.
But in this chapter, the lack of evidence for hierarchy doesn't lead them to the same conclusion.
Right.
Yeah. It's confusing what their line is on this.
Yeah, and I think this gets at the heart of like what has been pretty challenging this time around with the close reading of the book. And it's something, you probably noticed we keep coming up against in the podcast as we talk about it, is why do they want to see hierarchy? To the point that they see it even when there's not good evidence for it. And to the point that they use some rhetorical strategies to confuse the discussion, where they conflate voluntary hierarchy with more dominating forms of entrenched hierarchy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, in some contexts, they call it all play hierarchy.
Right.
Even when they're including examples of dominance hierarchy, like the Eskimo or the Kwakiutl. And then in some cases, they call it all authoritarian.
Right.
Even when there's not evidence for it being authoritarian. So the context shifts too.
Yeah, I've been sitting with this issue and trying to figure out why they do want to see hierarchy where they are telling us it is. And, as they point out at the beginning of this chapter, for any of us to talk about the Ice Age or prehistory is to do a form of myth-making, because we can't actually know. But they don't keep saying that. They kind of tell us we can know.
Well, they say that before there's good archaeological evidence is where we shouldn't be talking about.
Right.
But they think these burials and Göbekli Tepe and stuff is like good archaeological evidence so that they can talk about that era.
Yeah, and I guess that I don't see them as solidly saying one thing as they do, maybe. Right. And to me, it feels like there's still a lot of myth-making or projection onto these sites from all kinds of people, you know? And so, say, like, you and I learn about Göbekli Tepe, and we're like, cool. This is an example of pre-agricultural or just non-agricultural peoples who might have horticulture. Maybe they're doing some like wild tending, but they're not domesticating any grains.
Right.
And yet they're having these huge cooperative efforts, and it feels exciting to us. And so we see the possibility for communal work and cooperation in a site like this. Meanwhile, someone else can look at the same site, and someone who has, say, a pet theory about an ancient civilization who actually is responsible for everything that's ever happened in Earth in these prehistory sites might see Göbekli Tepe as an example of a place where this ancient civilization came and whispered, here's how you do this stuff, and then moved on, or something.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Meanwhile, the Davids see this same site and are like, yes, here we have some more examples of hierarchy, maybe not, that can help us with this idea that everybody was egalitarian in prehistory.
Help us reject this idea. Yeah. Yeah.
So they want to see that. And where we are is like, why do they want to see that evidence? And
why is that better?
Yeah. Right. And because one of the good pieces of criticism that we've read about the book from one of their colleagues is by Walter Scheidel. And we can link to that. It's a solid piece. And it's not just a harsh criticism.
Yeah.
He admires some things about the work. But so I like it for that reason, because I feel like people can get pretty didactic and honestly a little hateful in their criticism of this book.
Kind of impatient with them or whatever. Yeah, the Scheidel piece is...
it's more measured.
Even-handed, but it is like a pretty piercing critique. Right. I think Scheidel is a professor of history, I want to say. But he's written about long history,
right.
and yeah.
But what he says is, sure, there may be evidence of hierarchy in these sites. There may be evidence of the kinds of social structures and moving back and forth that they're talking about.
Yeah.
But as he says, it's surely possible, but it's impossible to know.
Yeah, or at least given the evidence we have.
Given
now.
the evidence
Yeah.
we have. So I feel like they're doing their own myth making here, their own projection.
Well, they're also projecting, and this is also from the Scheidel piece, but they're projecting that these seasonal oscillations go all the way back
Right.
into the beginning of human history, because
Right.
they're basically saying, like, now that we've shown that prehistoric people spent their lives oscillating back and forth, creating hierarchies and tearing them down, and then you're like, whoa, maybe they did.
Right.
But you can't, from 3 burials and 1 monument, show that that's what all of prehistoric people did.
Right.
Yeah.
And you made a good case for not doing that at the beginning of the chapter.
Uh-huh.
Anyway.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I don't know, as I've sat with this and worried myself about what was happening and why I could feel like we're coming from similar mindsets and could see such different potential in these same sites.
Yeah.
The only thing that the only sense I can make of this is that they actually find the idea of moving in and out of hierarchy more liberating than just not having hierarchy,
Right.
which is confusing to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when I place them more in the context of the academy and the kind of folks that they're talking to and the kind of work that they're looking through, probably they could get impatient with some of the obsession with studying hunter-gatherers that they might be around, and idealization of those peoples.
Yeah.
That feels like probably a factor in this. That probably is a factor in their preference for just wanting things to be more complicated.
Uh-huh.
And as they see them, more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I personally find a history in which people find an infinite variety of ways of keeping hierarchy from emerging as pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I don't need it
Likewise.
to actually show up all the time
Yeah.
to be interested.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah, that is somewhat confusing.
that
there.
part's confusing, and they bring up another anthropologist, Pierre Clastre, who was an anarchist anthropologist in France, and he...
Legendary among anarchists.
Legendary, yeah, that's true.
Yes.
He author of Society Against the State, and they give him as an example as someone who posited that yes, a lot of the different cultural norms and societal structures of various stateless peoples were actually created to keep power from building up and to prevent the abuse of power.
And to prevent the formation of something like the state.
Like the state.
Yeah, his book is called Society Against the State because he studied like the Yanomami, and he saw how, interestingly enough, their like quote unquote primitive warfare practices were centrifugal, like they actually redistributed power arrangements instead of allowing them to accumulate.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, they do this to prevent the emergence of more restrictive social hierarchies.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and which is fascinating. And
Yeah.
I've seen folks who have applied that concept to different warrior models or tribes who, like the Celts, who had a lot of warfare but also kept states from coming into being.
Yeah.
And
Clastre has there's some problems with his work, but what it does imply, and the Davids love this about it, is that even people who've maybe never experienced the state know what they need to be aware of, know what they need to ward off and to prevent.
Right.
They somehow intuit that there is a worse thing that could happen if they let their society go a certain way.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of them are living at the same time as there are states and empires, and so as the Davids mentioned, like people got around in prehistory, and when there were societies that had state type institutions, they would interact
like the Inca Empire was
Inca.
in South America where the Yanomami lived. Yeah.
Right. They would encounter those and see what was possible. What the Davids don't like about Clastre is that he doesn't bring up seasonality and doesn't share that as an example of how people would intermittently experience hierarchy. The group he's working with didn't have that, so that's probably
why he didn't talk about seasonality, but the Graebids portray this as like a grave flaw, or a failing of Clastre's. But yeah, it's like So it's weird, like the Davids would prefer the Yanomame to not just have warded off hierarchy because they knew it was a trap that they could fall into, but they would prefer them to have actually been in that trap part of the year.
Right.
Like, that would make them a better model.
Right.
Is if they were in a hierarchical form and then were not in it.
Right.
You know, and that could show, because, and maybe I think this is what you're pointing to, is that like they want to rediscover the important thing for them is the power to dissolve the hierarchy.
Yes.
Because what they see is that if you're in a hierarchy and then you're not, then in that movement from hierarchy to not is the freedom to leave it.
Right.
And they're like, what's the nature of that freedom
Right.
to leave that hierarchy? And the way they're thinking about it maybe is that like in the Rousseauian hunter-gatherer egalitarian past, people never learn that skill because they're never in the hierarchy to learn how to be able to leave it.
Right.
And we, these people now, us, need to learn how to leave the hierarchy that we're in now. So actually that skill set is what's important.
Right. Right.
Something like that.
Something like that. And I think that's, yes, I think that is the crux of this. They think it is more liberating to consider a vast history with a common experience of people going in and out of hierarchy.
Yeah.
Interestingly, they're all about variety and what a wide spectrum of ways to live there are. So I'm not sure why there's not also room for people who did not go in and out of hierarchy within that projection onto history.
Right.
But
Right.
if we still accept that and say like, okay, we're going to go with this idea that this is more liberating.
And one of their examples is of people who went between two different kinds of hierarchy.
Right.
Right? So it's not always good. Like,
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll get to a more materialist
Yeah.
lens on this in a few minutes.
And I guess that this idea that it's more liberating to move in and out of hierarchy and to have that as something that one experiences or as a society or community that we experience and then move out of feels more liberating to them is somewhat counterintuitive to me because, I don't know, I guess it could be just as plausible that experiencing hierarchy part of the year makes you more ready to be in a hierarchical situation, right?
Right. Yeah, it seems like it's a lot easier to get stuck in hierarchy if you're actually in it half the year.
Right. You know?
But they're actually proposing this view as more liberating than the view that original people didn't even have to experience it that much.
Yeah.
But this is a tempting reading of, not tempting because I like it, but like it's a tempting interpretation of what they're saying as far as trying to make sense out of this is that it's almost like they're saying, this is our original freedom. Is not the freedom that Christopher Boehm and all these other people portray of nomadic hunter-gatherer bands, but who are mostly living in not hierarchy. But our original freedom is the freedom to only be dominated part of the time.
Right. But I will say that I think that when you touched on it earlier, that the memory of how to dismantle hierarchy being also something that we inherited alongside the capacity to keep hierarchies from developing.
Yeah.
If we can figure out a way to get to keep both of those.
Yeah, right.
Without having to prioritize, therefore we need to think everyone lives with hierarchy part of the year.
Yeah.
Although surely hierarchy part of the year would be better than hierarchy all of the year, which is what we have right now.
Yeah, for sure. And, truly, like, we live in a very entrenched hierarchical society now.
Right.
And most people in the world do. And so, yes, moving away from hierarchy, having it in our lives, and then being able to dissolve it or whatever, let's just say dissolve, is a great thing to be able to think about. And I can even see the argument that this is like maybe more relevant. I don't know if I agree, but I can maybe see the argument that this is more relevant than studying the ways that power is managed in small bands. Sure. Although, to be honest, like, studying the ways that power is managed in small bands and keeping the bullies from getting the upper hand actually reminded me a lot of attempts at egalitarian power structures in subcultures that I've been a part of in my lifetime.
Right.
Like sometimes when I read about the way that hunter-gatherers interact amongst themselves, I'm like, this reminds me of what we were like when we were punks.
You're right.
And how we would kind of make fun of like the strutting alpha guys and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that's an aside. I think they're both relevant,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So that is all interesting to think about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still not sure that what they have shown us, though, is people who know how to magically dissolve hierarchies.
Sure.
And I have a couple words I want to say about that specifically at the end.
Okay, yeah, but before you do that,
Right.
I just want to talk a little bit about the ways that they talk about us still having some examples of seasonality in our cultures.
Yeah, let's do that, because I actually really like this part of the chapter.
Yeah. They spend some time talking about the ways that there's still a lingering remnant of seasonality in festival culture or holiday seasons.
Mm-hmm.
So a broader example of this would be different cultures that have winter holidays. And whether at times when there is supposed to be more of a feeling of generosity, of sharing. Unfortunately, this gets funneled up into consumerism, but there is supposed to be a time of goodwill and more rest.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, this kind of reminds me, this is not so much about generosity, but I was thinking about how one of our midwife friends told us that more babies are born in late August, early September than any other time of year.
Uh-huh.
And that that kind of maps back to people...
It's like near the solstice holidays?
Getting it on
around the solstice.
Around the solstice.
Yeah. The winter solstice.
The winter solstice.
Yeah.
As a time when people just like maybe honestly have a little more time off, probably are drinking.
Yeah.
There's a lot more like feasting and hanging out, you know?
Right.
And so even that is like an interesting marker of there being a birth boom at that time of year every year because it's such a regular time.
Yeah, totally.
So we have these lingering times of just doing less work, ideally. This doesn't always happen to everybody.
Yeah.
And feeling just like things are different. And then for those who get to live in a place that actually has carnival, then you get a very lively and wonderful example of this seasonality.
Right. Because this is what the Davids are trying to, this is the line that they're trying to, the thread that they're trying to pull through, is that even in maximum consumerized United States, there's holidays.
Right.
And if you go back in time and you go to other cultures and you go not that far away from like the hyper-capitalist core in time or in space, then you have even more of these, you know, and you have extended festivals like Mardi Gras or Carnival as it's known in other places. And the Davids are linking these to the seasonal oscillations of the past. That they're projecting into the past. And what this really speaks to is like the cyclicality of life, right? Like capitalism is famous for having transformed time into something linear, right? Like there's actually a arrow of progress where we're like hurtling into the future. Capitalism makes time linear almost for the first time. And, you know, not in every sense, but in an important sense. And the cyclical oscillation of the past, of like the Namaquara, of the Inuit, of all these people who they mention in the book, the cyclical oscillation is echoed in the way that we move cyclically through these holidays. And that maybe in some sense, like having carnival every year where for a brief period of time, there's this camaraderie and sort of rules are broken and the ordinary hierarchies are somewhat eclipsed, is what we have now as the remnant of the free time of year that we used to experience more of in the past. Like what the Inuit had in their big house when all the food was shared and people just like drank and laughed and were with their extended family and got it on and all of this stuff, that our holiday times where families get together and share food, like whether it's around the winter solstice or whatever time of year, are an echo of that.
Right.
And we look forward to these because it is the time of like camaraderie and freedom and less work and toil.
Yeah, and the cultures that actually get to keep the seasonal, or who have gotten to keep their seasonal holidays, including Jewish, Islamic, and Persian holidays in the fall and spring, these holidays like around the equinoxes that are also in place to mark either a closing of the year and a time of reflection or the beginning of a new year and an excitement like those. There are a lot of cultures that still have those in place as well. These times of like renewal and reflection and those cycle. I love that thing that you said about how the cyclical time undermines capitalist linear time.
Yeah.
I think that's really exciting. And I love that they brought up in the book that May Day has the radical history that it has because of its ties to Beltane. And that May Day, which is Labor Day around the world in general, right?
Yeah, May Day is like the socialist, like leftist workers' holiday.
Right.
Not the appropriated like Labor Day that was created to take energy away from May Day.
Right.
But the original communist holiday. Yeah.
But May Day, that holiday was that because so many peasant uprisings and riots and celebrations that turned political happened because of the May Day festival.
Of the Beltane celebrations, like it would burst out into a revolt.
Because people would, see what life is like outside of the work, be tied back into that vitality and riot of life that is spring in early May, and be tied into that cross-quarter cyclical holiday.
Oh my God. I know very well the feeling of being like in Mardi Gras in the city of New Orleans on the street and just feeling the energy of it and just the riotous, like the people just taking over the city in a certain way. And of course, Mardi Gras is super commercialized and, all of this, but still I've been in that space and just thought, drunkenly or whatever, we can do anything.
Right.
We can do anything. It feels like liberating. And that's part of what they're saying is that in these spaces, maybe not all of, like maybe some more than others or whatever, but the potential of some of these spaces is that it's a window into another world.
Right.
Another social relation.
Yeah. So when you start to think about it that way, you're like, well, more holiday would be better than what we have right now. More.
Yeah.
So that's when I can start to be like, well, sure. Part-time hierarchy would definitely be better.
Yeah.
I'm just not convinced that it's as freeing of a concept to consider humans having always had hierarchy some of the year as they do.
And now, as we wind down here at the end, I want to share some thoughts that I've been having about what I see as a missed opportunity, where we could have learned, where the readers of The Dawn of Everything could have learned a little more about the people whose cultures have these seasonal variations, but that the authors kind of overlooked. A lot of this follows from observations that Daniel was making on the What is Politics podcast. So some of this is going to be restating some of his analysis, but then also adding my own thoughts. So I just want to acknowledge that. As we've been saying, what's exciting for them is to see these folks who lived one way part of the year and another way in a different part of the year as having this power to shapeshift their culture. And maybe that's a power that we can reclaim. But what's kind of unsatisfying and also kind of unsettling to me is that where that leaves us is trying to imagine this kind of like magical power to shapeshift your culture. And that the people who they're describing who had this power, like what gives them this power? Where does it come from? And it's like mystifying. It kind of mystifies what they're doing. Like, what is this thing that they have that we lack?
Right.
And it makes it kind of hard for us to relate to them. And honestly, I feel like that's a kind of un-Graeberian move in a way, because one of the things that I've always really liked about Graeber, or, he's always been very adamant about this, and I respect this about him, is that he is always very adamant about portraying people who have lived in any time period anywhere on the earth as people like you and me.
Right.
Who act within their world in a way that you or I could relate to.
Mm-hmm.
And as like people with hopes, fears, politics, aspirations, like power struggles and stuff, just like me and you.
Mm-hmm.
And he is really into like demystifying
Mm-hmm.
the other and bringing people who are in a lot of ways very different from each other into conversation with one another.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what they're doing with Candy Aronk, right? Bringing Indigenous America literally into conversation with colonial like European culture. Or, I mean, they didn't arrange that encounter, but they're highlighting it for this reason. So it's strange to see this example of kind of like a mystification, what seems to me like a little bit of a mystification. But they kind of insist towards the end of this chapter that there's no rhyme or reason to these different cultures' patterns of oscillation. They list all these different examples, and then they say, this is page 115, in other words, there's no single pattern. The only consistent phenomenon is the very fact of alteration and the consequent awareness of different social possibilities, unquote. But is there really no pattern? Is there no sense to be made of the seasonal alterations of these different people? The question that they don't really explore very much is why. Like, why do the Plains Indians congregate for the buffalo hunt for part of the year and they benefit from this coercive force that enforces rules, but not in the other part of the year? Or why do the circumpolar Inuit have this biphasic way of living? And why would they live in patriarchy part of the year, but not in the other part of the year? And the place that the Davids leave all of this is just that, well, because people are different, because everybody's different. It's a carnival parade, right? But I think that if we put our materialist glasses on, that we can actually, to some degree, start to discern why these social transformations might have been taking place in the way that they did, and that would actually make these people a little bit more relatable to us and less mysterious. Like what they're doing might look less mysterious.
Yeah, I'm actually really curious about what are the material conditions, because clearly there are some. This is not arbitrary.
Yeah, and the Davids will say, like, to take the circumpolar Inuit, who I'm about to talk about because I did read the book about them, like, the Davids will say that the animals that they hunt are dispersed in part of the year and they're congregated in the other part of the year. And that's why the people are dispersed and then congregated.
Right.
So they will acknowledge that ecosystemic or environmental, or however you want to put that, condition that leads to the people being dispersed and then congregated. But what they don't follow through on is maybe trying to account for how the changes in the social structures might actually mirror that pattern. Like, for instance, with the Inuit, in the summertime, when the people are dispersed, they are in small groups of nuclear families. Maybe one or two, like, nuclear families, right? It was like a man and his wife and their unmarried children. And maybe one or two of these families. And this was the time of year when it was patriarchal. And that the father had absolute command over everybody. And if we think about this just a little bit, we might imagine that this material condition would be actually fertile ground for patriarchy. Because the nuclear family is like pretty famous for being a patriarchal structure.
Right.
And when wives or women aren't able to avail themselves of support networks outside of their partnership, then they very easily fall under the domination of their husband. And that it's like more sophisticated support networks that are a big part of preventing that from happening. And so if you're dispersed out on the ice, and, you're just with your kids and your husband, or maybe like another patriarchal, or, like another nuclear family, just kind of like yours, then the things that keep patriarchy from really dominating the day in and the day out are a lot harder to access. And, you can't really just get up and leave and go join another family group because you're not part of that family and they're just trying to survive and now you're another. I mean, it's a tighter situation for these people. And so even without doing like a really detailed analysis, you can imagine how this might be a material condition that would predispose to the patriarchal rule of these men. And that maybe the Inuit women who were in this condition were kind of stuck in that condition, actually.
Yeah, and maybe you can get stuck in seasonal hierarchy.
You can get stuck in a seasonal hierarchy.
Right.
You know, like they want to say that these people were wonderfully unstuck from hierarchy, but maybe in the part of the year where they had hierarchy, they're actually stuck in that hierarchy. You know, I mean, especially if you're looking at the people who are suffering from the dominance.
Right.
And that maybe given a chance to shift the balance of power more in favor of women's power, the women would have taken that chance. But the conditions didn't really present very many possibilities, you know. And then, you know, also what happens in cultures over time is that as a balance of power settles in and becomes entrenched, like in the sense of if there's conflicts between a man and his wife on the ice in the Inuit summertime, that there's a very good likelihood that the man is going to win those conflicts. Then what happens culturally is that everybody internalizes those power dynamics to a certain extent. Not that there's no more like revolutions or something, but that people, it becomes like kind of part of the culture and sometimes part of maybe even the identity that that's the way things are. And that's, to a certain extent, that's a practical strategy to prevent there from just being conflicts all the time, which can be very disruptive to even to survival.
Right.
And then in the wintertime, you know, people congregate and the dynamics are totally different. The women have more support network to avail themselves of both sexes, like her brothers, like maybe her father is in there. I'm talking about like a particular wife who was out on the ice, you know, in the summertime. And now it's just a bigger group and people are kind of looking out for each other more.
And you can build coalitions. I mean, what I keep thinking about is the Boehm work and Klostra, really. I mean, they're very similar, actually, in some ways. At least the conclusions that can be drawn from both of their works. But that, you know, in the nuclear family, we can't build a coalition when there's just like a handful of people. It's a lot harder. When most of them are children or something.
Right.
You know?
I mean, you can imagine it. You can imagine it in a kind of fantastical way, but not. Yeah.
And with patriarchal tyrants and nuclear families, as a lot of people know from firsthand experience, people can bond together to protect each other from the violence or the tyranny.
Yeah.
But there's not a lot you can do other than that.
Yeah.
Sometimes, you know. But when there's even a few families together, then there is more of a chance for coalition building and for checking power and for making sure that things don't get out of hand.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So it actually builds more on Boehm's work.
Yeah.
And shows that to be more true. Just that the big, you know,
that's a fact.
If
Yeah,
like
you can apply
group,
that to it.
Yeah. If there's a larger group, you're going to have more chances to protect each other and to keep people from being abusive.
That's a really great point. Yeah. Yeah. The nuclear family is really, there's not a lot of opportunity there for anti-authoritarian coalitions.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. So, you know, with just a little bit of thinking, like we can imagine what the Davids are failing to imagine, which is that material conditions related to this seasonal way of life and the way they're pursuing game actually have a big influence on what the political forms are in each of these times of life, right? Now, there's still questions. There's still questions about it. It doesn't, like, that's not the end of it. Like Mouse himself in the book, he's talking about these material conditions. And he points out, like, now, the Eskimo did not have to build these big houses and live in them. You know, that was a choice.
Right.
Like a David Wengrow type of choice. Like, they could have just, like, the animals were congregated, but the Inuit families could have just put their tents all side by side all together and still lived as nuclear families in their tents all together. But instead, they built this big house and went inside of it. Right. And so the seasonal variation of the seals and the walruses and stuff does not answer why they chose to build a big house instead of each live in a bunch of tents side by side. Right. So there is choice, right, about that. And, you know, like we could get into that more and try and think about it more or something. But so this gets really interesting because this is where, you know, you consider the material conditions and then there's choices that are happening within the material conditions. And Mouse himself, he talks about how the Inuit were really attached to their very particular like waterproof boots that they wore. And he pointed out, like, this is referenced obliquely in The Dawn of Everything, but how the Athabascan people who were their like regional neighbors and who they had a lot of contact with wore snowshoes. And that perhaps the Inuit could have benefited from adopting the Athabascan snowshoes, and it would have allowed them to shift their pattern of seasonal subsistence to supplement the waterproof boots with these Athabascan snowshoes. But in the Mouse book, he says, but the Eskimo keep so much to their traditional organization that they hardly dream of changing. You know, so there is this sense of like Inuitness that people have an attachment to.
Right.
Even in the face of something that could change their material conditions. You know, so this is like, I think, a more nuanced, in-depth way of talking about some of the stuff that they're getting at in here in The Dawn of Everything, where it's like, yeah, there is a sense that people, they have these cultural identities. They choose, there's something about being an Inuit person that they're attached to. And it is entangled with their power sharing structure and their political structure and all of this stuff, you know? But in the example that Mouse gives us, that at least in theory, the Inuit could put on snowshoes and live a little bit, you know, kind of differently, and that might change their way of life in important ways. You see the possibility of changing your material conditions. This is super important because forever the Davids are trying to imply that materialism is a prison. You know, that to like see these material conditions in the way that I've just been talking about is to imprison people in like a deterministic way of being. Like, well, if the material conditions of the seals and the walrus and the seasonality of the ice flows and stuff is what makes the Inuit break up into nuclear families at a certain time of year, then what's the hope of ever breaking out of that? But humans are very notably an animal who changes their material conditions.
Right.
In such a pronounced way. We are infamous for doing this, you know?
For better and for worse.
For better and for worse. But changing our material conditions is a human thing. Like maybe more so than almost any other animal. You know, yeah, like beavers are famous for, there's all these animals that are famous for like changing their material conditions. And I'm sure that that's even underestimated, you know, how much animals take part in this, but humans for sure. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that the materialist lens, I don't think it has to be a prison because we change our material conditions, you know, and we can change our reality partially by changing our material conditions and not just our cultural ideas.
I think that, and we'll be getting into this as we move through the book more because this isn't going away, but I know that I'm looking for clues or tips for thinking about like how can we, moving into the future, create societies that don't have hierarchy or abuse of power, even when there might be times where it's expedient to have leadership or to have some leader roles, you know, as we move in through the crumble or whatever we want to say that we're doing right now. There may be more and more opportunities for us to forge these kinds of societies. But I think that having rose-colored glasses on where it's just about choice is not going to help us.
Right.
And we have to be able to assess the actual limitations of material conditions, which do exist. There are limits. But also thinking about the ways that we can be adaptive, can change our material conditions. But I think that while they see examining material conditions as limiting, as you said, I think it is important for us to know what the limits are and what can be limiting or what are preconditions for certain kinds of hierarchy. And so that's the kind of like patterns that I see emerging even as we look at the work that they talk about in the book. Is that we start to see some preconditions. And whether or not those are necessarily building into automatic hierarchy or permanent hierarchy, because they seem okay with seasonal hierarchy.
Yeah, true.
You know, whether or not we can think about them as being preconditions to unfair distribution of power, to absence of freedom, without thinking that it's necessarily going to create that. Like it doesn't have to create abuse of power, but it can be a precondition to abuse of power. So I guess what I'm getting at is just that this is helping me like crystallize looking for those patterns.
Yeah, yeah. And you can use, one of the cool things about the anthropological lens is that you can use these as thought experiments where, like in the last episode, I talked about the very well documented pattern of patrilocal residence, of like nomadic herding people forming a male defensive force of closely related males, and that giving rise to patrilocal residence, which gives rise to male dominance. And this is all very well documented. But then I was thinking about this morning. What if you saw that was a possibility, that's a very common way for that to go?
Right.
And then you're like, how about we make sure that our defensive force is not composed of closely related males,
right?
But we just intentionally mix it up and we make that a cultural feature that we don't let go of. That now, since the males do not have to be closely related, we don't have to have patrilocality and make that work in some way. So anyway, I mean, it's just a thought experiment about where you get into like a leverage point, like a hotspot, and then you're like, okay, how can we find a variable that we can change in there that would lead to a different outcome?
Yeah. I mean, and that feels exciting to me, to be like, instead of saying, well, it's just anything goes, people just live whatever way, like actually start paying attention to those patterns, identify them, and head them off.
Yeah.
Which would be us tapping into the threads that are exciting to talk about, what Klostra saw, what Boehm saw.
Yeah.
Which is creating societies who are conscious of what is possible and are working to head it off.
Yeah, right. Yeah. They bring up so many rich, educational, inspiring examples in this book, but then unfortunately the way they handle them prevents us from learning what there is to learn from those examples.
Right.
And so hopefully this is what we're trying to draw out from these conversations about the book. I think I had kind of an epiphany with this chapter where I realized that maybe the hope that Graeber is looking for is actually to be found in the ability to change our material conditions rather than where he looks for hope by ignoring material conditions.
Right. And I would add to that given the state of the world and the crisis that we're in, this is no time for us to be ignoring material conditions.
Yeah.
If there was ever a time that we needed to actually pay attention to what is happening and also learn to reweave ourselves into the web of life as part of what needs to happen to move forward in a way that is in better relations with the rest of life.
Yeah.
That requires us actually paying close attention to material conditions.
Yeah. Maybe being more bonded with them than ever.
Right.
It's a wrap.
All right. I did just want to say before we go that there is some conversation around all this that is going on in the Discord server. So if you're interested in talking about this and tracking these ideas, what's possible, and what are our examples we can draw from, come and join the Discord server and talk to us about it.
Yeah. And believe it or not, as long as these episodes have been getting, there's a lot that we wish that we could talk about, does not actually make it onto the episode. And the Discord server is a place where we can talk about those things too. All right, so we'll see you next time for Chapter 4, Free People.
The origin of cultures.
And the advent of private property.
Not necessarily in that order.
Bye, y'all.